Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so, maybe a little less this time. It's our 267th episode being recorded on Thursday, August 13th, 2020 at 6 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. We've got Simon McDonald, who's going to give us his talk on PWAs, how did we get here? And just before we go, before I go and let him take over, I want to remind you down at the bottom there, you see that all the sessions are recorded and it'll be available probably by tomorrow at recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com. And so with that, Simon, thank you for coming on, and go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, Charlie. And you know what they say, it's save the best for 267th. Honestly, I wish I could back that up, but we'll see how this goes. All right, I'm assuming that you can see my screen right now. So if you just give me an okay on that, I can start. All right, well, usually I'd be giving a talk. I could see everybody's wonderful faces and kind of feed off the crowd, but we're in our new normal now, so things are different, and we're doing this all virtually. Today I'm here to talk to you about progressive web apps and how did we get here? But really, before I dive into that, I just want to introduce myself. I mean, Charlie already told you, my name is Simon McDonald. You can find me pretty much anywhere on the internet at McDonaldST, whether that's Twitter or Instagram or whatever. It was my first Unix user ID, and it's available everywhere because nobody in their right mind would pick that as a user ID, but I stuck with it because consistency is, wait, oh no, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. Wait, I just owned myself. Oh well, that's life. But besides that, what I do for a living is I'm a developer advocate for Adobe. And I know this is a ColdFusion meetup group, and I just want to say, I'm sorry. Yeah, Adobe hasn't always been the best to our developer communities, and I know that some of you have probably suffered through that. I'd be happy to talk to you about that experience because I'm always looking for ways to make life better for Adobe's developers. And if there's any way that we can prevent the mistakes of the past, I would like to hear about it. And this is honestly me saying that, not something that the company is asking me to say. Anyway, as you may be able to see by this slide, it's something I used to, well, in person, I would do this quite a bit. It's my infinite Simon slide. So every time I give a talk, I would get somebody to take my picture in the audience and tweet it at me so I could keep a record of everywhere I've been. It's kind of hard to see on your screen, but it goes back a couple of years, so it's kind of Simon's all the way down. So, you know, I'm super happy to be here to give this talk. I've actually given it once before, and the question is like, what qualifies for me to do this talk? And it's like, it's a really good question. So, you know, the first time that I did this talk was as the Certified Fresh conference earlier in the year. And my friend Henri was completely in my corner. I really appreciate him pumping my tires. He's like, you know, who better than to give this talk? And I come from Ottawa, Ontario, which is where I'm sitting right now. It's home of a couple of, you know, huge Canadian tech companies that are really no longer with us. And I've been around for a while. And so what I think Henri was trying to say is that I'm old. I'm super, super old. So I can kind of tell you this story. Now, if you were looking for a real hard-hitting presentation where we got into the nitty-gritties of a lot of things, probably not going to get that today. I mean, it's August, it's the middle of the summer. Let's try to have some fun with things here. So hopefully this talk will give you an overview of progressive web apps and really how we got to this point. But the first thing that we need to do is we need to, you know, describe what is a progressive web app. Now, generally, I would work the audience, figure this out, but I can't see any of you, so let's define it ourselves. Yeah, progressive web apps use modern web capabilities to deliver an app-like user experience. It's like, okay, that's pretty good. And they've evolved from, you know, pages in the browser, and they have tabs, top-level apps, you know, web security, low friction. And it's like, okay, that sounds good. But, you know, I started thinking, wait a minute, are progressive web apps just web pages? Is that all they are? I mean, yeah, that's all they are. It's a really good marketing term that Google came up with, but in the long and the short of it, they're just web pages. So I had to start asking myself the question. It's like, how is it that we are 30 years into developing for the web and delivering, web pages, HTML, JavaScript, CSS is still the best way to develop web applications? Like, how haven't we evolved past that at this point in time? And this is where I want to take you. I want to flash back to the very beginning of the web. And we're going to just work our way forward through time. And we're going to take a look at all the different technologies that were introduced, how people build upon the technologies that came before them. I think it was Isaac Newton said, we only have gotten this far because we, standing on the shoulder of the giants that came before us. And I'm probably horribly butchering that quote, but that's okay. You can't correct me because I can't see you. All right. So if we go all the way back to 1989 through 1993, this young, fresh-faced physicist here, Tim Berners-Lee, well, back in 1989, he had the idea for the World Wide Web, but he never got a chance to work on it. He had other OKRs that he had to be working on. Hopefully you all don't have to do OKRs. But around the early 1990, he got a chance to start working on it. And by the end of 1990, he had invented three little things that you may have heard of, and that's HTML, URI, and HTTP. So that's a pretty good deliverable in 1 year. I mean, if I had one of those things in my career, I'd be pretty happy. And also, if that wasn't enough, besides those three specifications, he also delivered the world's first web browser and first web server in 1990 as well. So pretty good. Unfortunately, in 1991, I hear when he was getting his yearly review, they're like, well, what have you done for us lately, Tim? It's like, last year was great, this year, not so much. So anyway, it wasn't until 1991 that people from outside CERN, which was in Geneva, Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken, were actually invited to participate in the web for the first time. So that was a huge deal. And a lot of us wouldn't be in the careers we are today if it wasn't for that. And following on in 1993, which is where we'll end this slide, was the monumental decision to make all of the underlying code of the web royalty-free. So yeah, can you imagine what it would be like if a company tried to control the web from the very beginning? Would we have the explosion of technology that we have today? And I have to argue that there's no way in hell that we would. So I'm really glad that these crazy physicists in Switzerland decided that, yeah, hey, let's make that free for everyone. Just get a sip of water. So going forward just a year, in 1994, Tim was done with CERN and he moved to MIT, where he founded this thing that you may have heard of, the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C. And 1994 also included the release of the HTML 2.0 spec, which is great because it formed the foundation of a lot of the semantic web that we use today. However, the HTML spec introduced the web's most important tag ever. And again, if we were in person, I would ask you to shout out what your answers are, but I'm not going to leave you in suspense. It was the image tag. Of course, it's the image tag. And it was first released in the HTML 2.0 spec. And without it, I don't think the web would take off the way it did in the early days, because without the image tag, where would we have cat pictures? You would not be able to get cat pictures on the internet. And that's just a total shame. I mean, isn't that, I think that's what the internet was made for. So it's pretty hilarious when you think about it. So the HTML 1.0 spec had functionality for mathematical formulas, but not images. So you can see, the use case that they were trying to solve, and then how it became more general over time. So that was really the beginnings of the web. And moving along to 1995-96, at Sun Microsystems, they were working on a language called Java, and it was created by this gentleman here. His name is James Gosling. And if you are relatively new to technology, you may think of Java as being completely a server-side technology. And that wasn't really the case. It was originally developed to be an embedded technology. And Sun made a very big push for it to be a client-side language. So back in 1995-96, Java gained a ton of popularity. I actually remember being on a co-op work term, and I know that I'm dating myself there by giving you that information, but writing an applet for my team's webpage, and people just freaking out, like, "Oh my God, you know Java?" And it's like, I just copy and pasted some code from the web. It's like, wow, okay, so that's cool. Anyway, that copy and pasting code has done me pretty well over my career. So moving forward a little bit to take a look at what Java applets were, their big claim to fame is that you could write them once and run them anywhere. And it's like, that was a way for you to reduce the cost of having to develop for a whole bunch of different platforms. And they were completely sandboxed, so you weren't able to access the local file system or make network calls to other domains other than the domain that the applet was downloaded from. And if some of these things seem familiar, yeah, of course. Same thing when you run into CORS issues now. It's like, that wasn't a problem before, but now that these Java applets could make network calls outside of the domain that they were downloaded from, they had to be able to sandbox them. And that's the same thing that came forward when we had XML HTTP requests and being able to sandbox those requests, or CORS issues. And then, of course, it introduced something called AWT, which was the Abstract Window Toolkit. Now, that was a bridge to underlying native user interfaces. So it was a real pain, because every time you went to a new operating system, those underlying components had to be completely rewritten. And so that involved a lot of work to maintain that. And then, of course, what we learned not too long after that, about 2 years, Sun Microsystems had this thing come out called Swing, which was completely Java-based. It didn't worry about any of the underlying components in order to be able to be displayed. And Swing was a lot easier to work with and a lot less for maintenance. And after that, following pretty closely on its heels, was this language called JavaScript. And you may recognize Brendan Eich there. So he was hired by Netscape to work on this scripting language. It was originally released as LiveScript. You probably don't remember that name, or maybe you do. But Live Server was a product that Netscape had at that time. It was their web server. It's how they were making money. So they decided to have LiveScript. But they quickly renamed it to JavaScript. And that was in order to take advantage of Java's popularity. Now, it's always funny when you think about it, because Java is to JavaScript as car is to carpet. They have nothing in common, really, other than having a C-like syntax. So yeah, marketing, gotta love it. Now, what we're seeing here is the second pillar of web development has been delivered, because we're able to add some interactivity to our web pages. That's fantastic. So we started with documents, now we can add interactivity. We're starting to build up things so that we can actually build web applications. Now, also in 1996, there was this company, it was called FutureWave, and it was purchased by Macromedia, and Macromedia Flash 1.0 was released. So Flash was used to display interactive web pages, do online games, and playback of video, which it was pretty huge at the time. And going forward with the maturity of that product, in 2000, ActionScript was released. And at one point in time, installations of the Flash plugin rivaled those of QuickTime, Java, every other plugin you could have for your browser. So Flash was absolutely huge. So I think at one point in time, you could make a lot of money just by putting a restaurant's menu up on an interactive Flash applet. So Flash became just crazy popular. And it's shockingly enough, it was around until just this year, where it was officially end of life by Adobe. So that was pretty shocking. Now, and the final pillar to modern web applications is in 1997, where CSS was released. Personally, I love this visual joke because I am CSS challenged. I've been using it for 23 years approximately, and I still have problems with it. I am not a designer. I know enough to pay one to do that work for me. So the problem with CSS around 1997 is it wasn't really well supported amongst all the different browser vendors, and it would take years before any one browser would fully support the specification. But this is the turning point where the third modern pillar of web application development was delivered so that we could use CSS in order to style things. Now, just after that, we had this, this explosion of things. It was like these phones. All of a sudden, everybody had a mobile phone. It wasn't relegated to like people carrying around giant briefcases or people having phones hooked into their cars. It's like everybody could drop a phone in their product, in their pocket. Sorry, not their product. And at that point in time, things like BlackBerry, Nokia, Ericsson, et cetera, they were all shipping, quote unquote, smartphones with rudimentary features like contacts, email, and web browsing. So there wasn't too much going on at that point in time. But by the time 2005 rolled around, there was about 3.5 million mobile phones. And in 2006, what we were seeing is that 6% of all phones being sold were, quote unquote, again, smartphones. So things were starting to move in that direction. And of course, we had the ability to browse web pages on our desktop computers, and now we had these always-on connected devices. Well, so why can't I use the web on my device? And that's where this technology called WAP came from. So remember, it's WAP, not WAT, WAP. So that's the wireless application protocol. And that's a way of accessing information over your mobile network. So web browsing was done by accessing pages coded in this thing called WML, or the wireless markup language. So WML was a subset of HTML, and it was a card-based layout. And ultimately, it didn't take off because people had to completely rewrite their web pages in order for them to be displayed on mobile devices. Later on, as technologies got better, we were able to replace this with responsive web design and CSS media queries. So we could actually detect the size of the devices that we were supposed to be displaying our web pages on and act accordingly. So, no, sorry. That is the WML example that we have here. Oh, look, BBC News. And then this happened. And it's supposed to autoplay.
I'm afraid we're not hearing that audio. I think there might have been a button you'd have to click in Zoom to allow that.
All right. Well, that is Steve Jobs' monumental introduction of the iPhone. And of course, he's saying that, it's an internet device, it's a music player, and it's a phone all together. So to say that this wasn't a huge seismic shift in the industry would be an understatement. So love him or hate him, Steve Jobs really delivered on this one, and Apple. So in 2007, that's when the iPhone first dropped. And it's kind of funny to think that it was only 13 years ago. It seems such a long time ago. So it was at the Macworld. He did it during the Macworld keynote. It was in January 9th of 2007. And the phone itself, the first generation of the iPhone, only supported the Edge network. So it didn't have a lot of even really better features for getting web pages to your device. It was using the same technology as that those previous phones from Nokia, BlackBerry, et cetera, were having, but it still was a seismic shift. And I'd say things really took off the next year in 2008 when the iPhone 3G was introduced. And so that added some functionality to the hardware, including GPS, which is huge for being, honestly, does anybody know how to get anywhere anymore? It's like GPS in your pocket. 3G to get you those better speeds, because now those web pages would be able to deliver to the phone a lot faster. You weren't waiting forever for them. And of course, the App Store. So, Before 2008, there was no app store in the iPhone. So the original iPhone just came with a set of packaged applications on it, and that was it. In fact, Steve Jobs was dead set against allowing any external developers to build apps for his device. So the initial plan was for Apple to be the only one to build apps for the iPhone, and everyone else would just, use web pages. And it's like, all right, that, it seems like a pretty good plan. And, why did they change their mind? It's like, in a word, money. Everybody's probably quite familiar with the success of the App Store itself. So pulling in 30% of the purchase price of every app on the App Store was a huge benefit to Apple's coffers. They raked in billions over the past decade and, 12 years, I suppose. But besides that, in 2008, in the rollout of the App Store and the ability for people to write their own applications for the iPhone, it also, in iOS 2.0, which is the operating system version that came out in 2008, it dropped this really important new component, and it was called the UI WebView. And once we had the UI WebView, we were able to build applications that depended upon the web. So PhoneGap is an open source project that I was actually in as a contributor for many, many years. And sadly, you may have heard on Monday, Adobe announced that it was end of life. It'll be end of life in October. Hopefully this doesn't shock anybody, considering nothing's been happening in that space for about 2 years. But I digress. The elevator pitch for PhoneGap was it's a framework for building mobile applications using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So the iOS version was created at an iPhone dev bootcamp in San Francisco by a couple of developers from a small consultant company in Vancouver called Natobi. And when those folks got back from that weekend and showed some of the other developers what they had done, the Android devs took it as a challenge to have the same functionality on Android. So all of this just pretty much came out at over a Hackfest weekend. Natobi was actually acquired by Adobe in 2011, and all of the source code for the PhoneGap project, which was already open source at the time, but still part of that acquisition, they wanted to make sure that it maintained its open source. It was all donated to the Apache Foundation, and it became Apache Cordova. And that was just so that it would remain free for everyone. It spawned a number of projects that were built on top of it, some things like Ionic, Monica, the Intel XDK. Contributions came from a myriad of companies, including Adobe, BlackBerry, Google, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, Mozilla, but never Apple, as far as I know. No one from Apple ever helped out, which it's too bad. And now the whole goal of PhoneGap was that someday it would cease to exist. And well, that happened this week. But basically, the team believed that the web solved the cross-platform development problem. And so the goal was to make the project so that you could build first-class, make the project a first-class development platform for building mobile applications. So the project polyfilled the native device APIs so that you could access them from your web view. The intention was only to bridge the gap between the current state of APIs and the current state of APIs in the browser and the current state of APIs in the device until such a time that browser vendors got around to catching up and enabling things like file access, contact access, taking pictures, et cetera, et cetera. So speaking of which, building this bridge was the key piece of technology. The PhoneGap to native bridge is what allowed you to make this call from the native layer and receive a response. That was a big thing that actually was used quite a bit in not just PhoneGap, but in other technologies that we'll talk about later. And the other thing is the PhoneGap project wanted to be able to implement a native-like API, like file or geolocation or camera. We always went to the W3C specification to see what the latest specs were, because we wanted to build the APIs that aligned with what the browser vendors were going to be doing so that one day those plugins would cease to exist inside of PhoneGap. So that was actually a mutually beneficial relationship between the PhoneGap Apache Cordova community, the W3C, and a bunch of developers. So the PhoneGap team didn't have to spend a lot of time designing APIs. They got that for free from the W3C. And the W3C got some very valuable feedback on their proposals. And at the same time, devs were able to use these devices able to use these device APIs without having to learn Objective-C or Java in order to build iOS or Android applications, or a myriad of other programming languages on different platforms. So you can kind of think of this as not unlike the role that Babel plays today, and allowing us to use the next generation of JavaScript syntax right now, even before it's implemented in the browser. And again, this is usually a spot where I ask for some audience participation, but I would like to see a show of hands of anybody who's actually used the W3C contact API specification. Yeah, it's probably just me. And I would like to say you're welcome, because we implemented this API. We fed it back to the W3C, and they decided not to proceed forward with it, which is pretty good, because can you imagine going to a web page and having them have the ability to suck all of the contacts off of your phone? That wouldn't be too good now, would it? All right. And back in 2010, Steve Jobs, put a stake through the heart of Flash. He announced that there is no chance that it would ever run on the iPhone or iPad, which was a terrible blow to that technology. And Flash continued to limp along for many more years, vulnerabilities being discovered occasionally, maybe frequently, but the product didn't officially get end of life until 2020. So pour one out for Flash right now. All right, let's try not to be depressing. Now, not too long after that, where we already had Android and iOS competing for dominance in the mobile phone market, Mozilla, a browser vendor, also decided that they would get together and they would create their own hardware and operating system. So FireFox OS, which ran on some very cheap hardware, because initially the plan was to have this deployed to countries that were still developing and couldn't afford $1,000 phones for everyone, but still allowed them to participate in the internet. So FireFox OS was designed to provide this alternate operating system for running web apps directly from the device or installed from their application marketplace. Now, all of the applications on FireFox OS were built using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they provided this robust privilege model, and open web APIs that can communicate directly with the hardware. And basically, they were using exactly the same business plan that Steve Jobs put forth in 2007 when he announced the iPhone. So they thought, hey, this is something that could quite work. Now, unfortunately, it didn't quite work. Mozilla stopped development of the project in 2015. The devices were pretty low powered in order to keep their costs down, and they didn't really compare favorably with existing smartphones. What we had found is that most people in developing countries would buy your leftover smartphones. So when you updated to that latest Android or iOS phone, your old phones would make their way to developing countries who would use them for many more years. So that almost worked, but it was an interesting try. The other thing that we really need to mention from the FireFox OS is it introduced this thing called the App Manifest. And basically, if you went to a web page or you went through their marketplace, you could, if there was a manifest available, you could actually install that phone directly onto, install that application directly onto your phone. And it detected that there was the ability to do that if the site had a manifest file. So you can see things like the name, the description, what URL to launch with, various icons, and the name of the person who's written the application. So does that, anybody know PWAs? Does that seem familiar? Well, it might later. But anyway, as we move forward in web technologies, I'm going to take a little detour over here into a particular framework. So React is huge right now, and also React Native is pretty big as well. And when it comes to writing an application using React Native, what you're doing is you're using JavaScript. JavaScript is using a bridge to communicate between the native layer and the web layer. So one of the engineers who worked on Apache Cordova PhoneGap at Microsoft went to Facebook, and this is where this bridge comes from in React Native. Is the technologies that he has learned when he was working in the open source Apache Cordova product. The other interesting thing about React Native is that it interfaces directly with native controls. And if you think back to 1995, 1996 with Java Applets using AWT, it's exactly the same thing. So there's really a chance that everything old becomes new again at some point in time. And that's always a good thing to think of. It's like, just because something didn't work before doesn't mean that technology hasn't changed enough so that it's, might not be a bad idea to give that another try. Because the constraints that you were operating under 10 years ago may be completely different from the constraints that you're operating under today. So what was too slow back in 1995, 20 years later, it's acceptable to be able to take that on. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now, don't worry. Finally, we're at progressive web apps again. So in 2015, Francis Behrman and Alex Russell, both from Google, they coined the phrase progressive web apps. And it's to describe apps taking advantage of new features supported by modern browsers, including service workers and web app manifests. So, and also lets users upgrade web apps to PWAs in their native operating system. So now we're getting into the differences between progressive web apps and regular web pages. So there's a few things that we should go over there. The first is that they have to be coming from a secure origin. So that means all progressive web apps have to be delivered over HTTPS. And that specification was first developed by Netscape in 1994 for Netscape Navigator. And of course, without Tim Berners-Lee, we wouldn't even have the HTTP spec. So, quick question. Anybody delivering their web apps over HTTP still? Anybody at all in the audience? It's like, all right, I know you can't answer me. But yeah, there's no reason to do that anymore. Even if it's just your own, kind of side project, you can go to Let's Encrypt and get a free SSL certificate. So that is a big recommendation for me because it not only protects your users, but you won't be able to get access to some of the newer web APIs unless you're delivering your web pages over HTTPS. So you may not be taking advantage of all of the capabilities of the web if you're still using HTTP. Another thing that progressive web apps have is the offline support. So they provide that by using a service worker, and a service worker is a type of web worker. So they work separately from the main browser thread, and they handle things like push notifications. They can synchronize data in the background, and they can cache or retrieve network requests. They can also intercept network requests as well. And if we think back, Apache Cordova apps provided offline support by packaging all of the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS onto the device so that you didn't have to go off to the web in order to download these things. So it was always available for you. And then there were ways of being able to update your application without having to go through the App Store, which is kind of the same thing that service workers allow you to do. They can go off and get the latest content for your web page, or even update the images or the Chrome around your web page. So I'm not going to talk about app cache. Nope, not going to do it. The other thing is that you need in order to truly have a progressive web app is the web app manifest. And so that's the way that they signal to the web browser that they are indeed web applications. And this web apps manifest is based off of a specification for the W3C. So you may notice that the specification looks an awful lot like what the FireFox OS was using back in the day, which is pretty much where this, this whole idea got its proving ground, was by FireFox OS. Now, unfortunately, iOS is still lagging a bit behind, and they don't fully support the web app manifests, but it has some additional things that you can do around meta tags that support a lot of the manifest files capabilities. So you can add things like the icon that should show up on the desktop, or what the splash screen should look like when it starts up. Now, you may think that Apple is dragging their heels on this, and you'd be right. You'd definitely be right. But I mean, they're protecting their investment in the App Store, and it's like, you know, if you could take 30 cents of every dollar that, you know, pass through your App Store, you'd probably do it too. But also, we have to give them credit, because they were the ones who first came up with this idea. Even back in 2007, you could go in your Safari browser on your iPhone and say add to desktop. And it was basically the first time that you had a progressive web app. It wasn't as good as what we have today, but it allowed you to save this app, on a link to this app on your home screen. And you could use the meta tags in order to provide an icon and some of the other things that we have today. So, you know, they were a little bit forward thinking, so I have to give them some credit. The other thing is, if you detect that there is a manifest file, your modern browsers can figure this out, and they can go through the installation side of things. So that's pretty fantastic. And then, of course, I already talked about how back in 2008, actually it's not 2007, it's 2008, with iOS 2.0, you're able to save web apps. So today's modern browsers have way more APIs than you can take advantage of to capture things like audio and video. And a lot of those APIs were prototyped in Apache Cordova a long time ago, and feedback was given to the W3C. So all of these things kind of are cyclical. So I'm gonna pat myself on the back there. It's all good. So this is a quote from Steve Jobs, and I promise I don't love Steve Jobs. It's just this, he's got good quotes. It's impossible to fail if you learn from your mistakes. So what I like to do is, in looking back on my career, I can see that the roadmap of technology is filled, just absolutely filled with failed projects. And I've been involved in some failed projects, but you can't really call them failures if you can learn something from them. As we've seen time after time after time, just because an idea didn't work years ago, it doesn't mean that it isn't viable now with just a few changes. And honestly, this is why junior developers are great. They don't actually know what won't work, so they can really surprise you. You may have gotten to the stage of the career that I'm at, which is the jaded old guy. So it's really great working with some younger developers, because they can really help energize you. And again, I'm on my soapbox again, but heck, yeah, have a diverse crew as you can, working with different ages, different backgrounds, different everything. It's going to make your product a heck of a lot better. So I love this quote. I think I mentioned it before, and I don't even really care if Isaac Newton never really said it, but yeah, you can look it up online. So as a technologist, the only reason we're able to do these amazing things that we have right now is because we're benefiting from the work of the people from past decades. So when you look back on things, try not to dunk on the old stuff as being bad. All of those developers were doing the absolute best they could. They wanted to create the best products they could possibly do, but they were under completely different constraints than you're under right now. So yeah, give them a hand. All right, so looking forward, where do we go from here? There's this thing that the future is notoriously hard to predict. And in fact, let's look at a couple of gems. Thomas Watson, I think that the world needs 5 computers. It's I can see 3 on my desk right now, and I'm not even counting my phone. So yeah, sorry, Thomas, you're wrong about that one. yeah, there's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. Yeah, Steve, that was not right either. Honestly, the iPhone itself should kind of changed the world. And it's not an exaggeration to say that. But here's the thing. I am going to try to predict the future a little bit for you. So let's get into, my predictions. Let's see. I think computers are going to get faster. I have this feeling that computers will continue to get faster. I'm betting that memory size will also get larger. So I think that's a good one to bet on. Dev tools will get better. So, these are some things that we can definitely count on. We're continuing to move the arrow of time as it shoots us into the future. These things are getting better all the time. And I know those weren't real predictions. They were pretty safe bets. So, I don't like to bet on things that aren't sure things. But there is one thing I will always bet on, and that's the web. I will always bet on the web. It has been through a lot, and it's carried us this far, and I don't see any reason why it won't carry us farther into the future. And with that, I just want to thank all of you for listening. Again, if you need to get a hold of me, just hit me up at McDonald'st. And I don't have to run anywhere right now, so if there are questions, feel free to ask them. And it's okay if you're shy. I'm shy too.
All right, thank you for that, Simon. So let's open the floor. Anybody have any comments, questions, observations, recollections? You're right. So Simon, do you feel like you can speak to that question about offline mode?
Offline mode in a ColdFusion website, or offline mode in general?
Well, you can start with general.
I do confess I am not very well versed in ColdFusion, but when it does come to offline mode, you would want to look at service workers. So if your website is served over HTTPS, that's a good first start, because you won't be able to use service workers unless it is over HTTPS. And then what you're able to do with service workers is cache all of your network requests. So the first time that somebody comes into your web page, obviously they will need to be online for that. And you can specify that all of your HTML, your CSS, your JavaScript gets put into a cache for you. And so that if they're offline, or if they turn off their Wi-Fi, or they're in like a tube somewhere on a train, and they can't get access to Wi-Fi or 3G or 5G or whatever they're using, it'll read from the cache instead. Now, service workers are an incredibly powerful technology, but it's pretty easy to shoot yourself in the foot with a bazooka with them. So I would recommend you looking at the service workers toolbox from Google. I do not recommend writing your own from scratch, especially if this is the first time that you've started using them. But they have some pretty good strategies for being able to work with service workers. And you can always start with different strategies, whether you always look to the cache and then go to the network, or if you look at the network and then go to the cache as a fallback. And you can also do fun things like have multiple different caches, have cache for your actual web application stuff, and have a separate cache for the content of your web application. Honestly, we could do a whole other 40 minutes on service workers, but yeah, I would start looking at them if you want to provide an offline mode for your web app.
I just found and shared a URL that talks about progressive web apps and offline mode and service workers. And of course, it doesn't talk about ColdFusion, but it talks about using URLs to talk to a backend. And so it could certainly talk to a ColdFusion backend. And just so you know, Simon, ColdFusion supports responding via JSON or any number of other kind of standardized approaches. This article didn't even talk about using JSON, so
yeah, no, you can cache the JSON as well. The neat thing about service workers, for folks who aren't very well versed in them, is that they're kind of like a man in the middle attack, but you control it. So when your web application on the client requests something via the network, it'll go to your service worker first, and that's where you'll be able to make a decision on whether or not you want to read from the cache or if you want to go away to the network. So you can do all sorts of fun things that way.
And then Derek asked, is there a sample PWA somewhere that he could tear apart and learn from?
Yes. You know, at the top of my head, Google has a lot of good kind of information on progressive web apps, because they were the folks who started it. To-do app, are folks, if you're familiar with to-do app, that is a repository that I think it was Adi Asmani created. Let me find that. And basically in the to-do app repository, there's an implementation of a very simple to-do application, but written in React, or written in Vue, or written in like any other different framework. And then, you know, some of them are progressive web apps, and it's a good thing for you to be able to compare and contrast all those different approaches.
And I just shared a link to a discussion of offline service workers from someone in the ColdFusion community. So might help you.
Sorry, it's to do MVC. That's the site. I'll just put that in the chat there. That's the one I was actually talking about. But yeah, there's good examples there.
Somebody just pointed out that my link I just tried to share ended up not being public. It turned out somehow it got changed to being private. I didn't mean that at all. So here we go again. Did that happen with my earlier one? Yeah, right. The earlier one I shared also somehow. Goodness. Oh, so Derek's note to me was private. That's why my response when I typed it in ended up being private. But, you know, what he asked wasn't something that needed to be private. So that's two different links. I hate the way it jams them together like that.
Yeah, that is tough to read. And I mean, honestly, we're all learning a new video conferencing service every 2 days, so it's it's to be expected.
All right. Well, it seems like that's it for the questions. Another thing Chat Connect had is we could see if somebody was typing. I don't think Zoom gives us any insight into whether someone's typing. So I'll just have to assume they're not. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording because maybe somebody's waiting to ask off the recording. But
That's
again,
good.
Thank you, Simon, for coming on. We appreciate it.
No problem. Happy to be here. Just too bad I couldn't see you all in person.
Thanks, sir.